One of the problems with the discourse around any particular socio-political issue is that the way the issue is fought will get embedded into the way the issue is studied over time. So I think it's a really important point. Stanford Schramm's book on words of welfare looked at how the welfare debate was all about self-reliance, about instilling self-reliance in largely women on welfare. And he then tracked how all of the evaluation of whether welfare works was about whether it succeeded in making these women self-reliant. It didn't look at intergenerational poverty. It didn't look at the long-term effects on children's educational scores. It didn't look on the structures of communities. So once the debate locks in to a sort of frame, then it drives everything else. So if you think of healthcare reform right now, the healthcare reform debate has been fought largely on cost. We will be evaluating whether it costs less, not whether it restructures the economy in a way that makes us more competitive, whether it solves problems in communities because people now have health access. The cost argument will structure and dominate the evaluation. So it's very important that we get in and contest things as they're being debated, so that there is at least a little bit of wiggle room in this structure of expectation about what policy should do as well. So when communications is inadequate, people default to the pictures in their heads. That's what we've been talking about. But when communications is effective, people can see an issue from a different perspective. And that's where the final area of the swamp that I want to investigate is. In some parts of the swamp, there are potentially useful and ecologically sound environments that require cultivation over time. So there are things in people's minds that they know and believe, whether you call them values that they think about the world or ways that they know the world works, that can be summoned, can be evoked to help people understand things that are very abstract and foreign to them. So this is from our work on obesity. What we were able to do here, this is sort of the one place I used some of our research findings, we were able to show that if you got people to think about ingenuity, that there are lots of problems in our society that we can solve and we should be solving them. If you got them to think about fairness between places, that some communities have not had opportunities and others have, and we need to change the distribution of resources. That when we were able to combine that with a simplifying model, a way of getting people to step back, a sort of metaphor that made things very concrete for them. In this case, it's the food and fitness environment. And when we looked at exposing them to a value and this model and tested it against their preference for a whole bunch of policies, we got a huge bump. We were able to move people in a different direction. So we moved them 12 points with one combination and 20 points in California with another combination. So that's a huge swing. It shows you on an issue like this that they may have a predisposition to think of it as an individual problem, but they are capable of seeing it as structured and built into place. They're just not getting those cues very often and with any regularity, so they're not seeing the broader context of the issue. So for us, over time, what we have come to believe is that the reframing equation requires three things. It requires a redirecting value that gets people off of individualism and there are other issues that don't devolve quite in that way. It requires a simplifying model, a metaphorical construct that allows people to see the world in a different way. We sometimes say to get the world down in front of them like a toaster, where they know if they put the toast in, it's going to pop up in a certain way. They've got to have some kind of concrete access to the way that a problem works. And then to begin to talk to them about solutions. So to map the redirection, the sense of how a problem works, and then to explain to them why a solution is important. That's very different than 9/10 of the communiques that we see. People start with a solution and then they kind of back into, well, let me tell you why I think it's important. The problem is that all of our structures of expectation are going to map onto that solution instantly. We're going to move in the direction of individual responsibility away from structures, and we will solve the problem, but not in the way that progressives would want to solve it. So let me just look at each of these. So when we talk about values, we're talking about big ideas like justice, prevention, family, equality, and opportunity. We are using these to explain these what we call level 2 issue domains about which people are relatively unfamiliar. We are using our simplifying models to explain how these domains work. And then we're going to issues that are fairly difficult for people to conceptualize. So if I take one that you all may not know much about, I don't know how many of you are fisher people. So if I said to you, I want to talk to you about bycatch, you're sitting there thinking, bycatch, I think it has something to do with fish. Maybe it's about those New England fishermen that I've heard about that are losing their wages because there aren't enough fish. So maybe we need some kind of economic stimulus for people who live in New England whose way of life is being destroyed by fishing. So you wander around trying to land upon an organizing principle or a value that would inform your understanding. Now that particular place of ending up would not make environmentalists happy. That's not what they wanted. But if you can redirect them, if you can say, we need to prevent problems in water environments just as we do land environments. We can't be wasteful about the environments that we have available to us. So I've done prevention, I've done environment, and bycatch, where people put out huge nets and throw away the fish that come in the nets and only take the good fish, is a wasteful practice that we should not be indulging in. Then you have a whole idea. You may not give a damn about bycatch, but it's connected now to something, and you have directed the pattern of thinking. We are convinced from the multi-method evaluation we do of simplifying models that once you know how something works, you are inoculated against lots of spin about it. So one of the powers of these metaphors is that they're so coherent that when people come at you, from other political positions, if you're focused on how something works, you can say, well, I don't really think that that's the way it works, because you have a very concrete way of thinking. So here are 2 simplifying models that we've developed over time. Just to give you an example, one on government. The main advantages that make America so successful come from what are called public structures. Public structures America has created include physical structures we need in order to get things done, highways, airports, communications grids, as well as the organizational structures we need, a postal system, delivering mail, etc. Third world countries have many smart, hardworking individuals, but they don't have the public structures that are essential for overall success. So we've been able to show over time that this particular way of thinking about government inoculates people against their default positions, which is government is going to eat up all individual responsibility. It puts them back into a kind of manager stance, and it creates much more robust conversations. And we'll look at that in a second. This is one of the simplifying models we've developed that is about the redistribution of goods. Most economists are now worried about what they call the patchwork effect. It's a problem that's forcing families and businesses to abandon small towns and rural regions. The network of basic services that our prosperity and quality of life depend on has never been developed. From transportation services to healthcare services, the patchwork effect is forcing people to leave towns and large areas that should be vital parts of the economy. So I'll show you in a second a little trigger video, about 5 minutes, that is how just this momentary exposure to one of these models inoculates against their habits of thinking. So we've talked about how those habits of thinking, those structures of thinking, would be highly individual. They would be non-connected. So if rural people have problems, it does not affect suburban or urban people. So the notion that we are all disconnected. And we would expect that certain habits would be unique to the way that we think about rural America, and some of those are about how it is falling behind in progress, and while that is problematic to the rural people, it is just regrettable and not a major concern. And they are not going to be able to understand why rural America is suffering. They're not going to be able to understand the structural deficits. So these models literally paint these pictures in people's heads. They literally are forcing people on an infrastructure. They know what a highway system is, and they know what maldistribution of goods is. So what I'm going to show you is a little video that interviews people on the street about rural America. When unaided, how they default to the structures in their heads. It's not that they hate rural people, but they have no way to think what is happening in rural America. And then the second part is when exposed to just that simplifying model. So they just were told by the videographer, I'm going to read a passage to you, tell me what you think about it, and tell me how you think about rural America. So look at the vast difference between this one exposure, just one oral exposure, and how people are able to reason.
As part of Cultural Logic's effort to find effective simplifying models, we first assessed people's default responses to the topic. When you ask Americans about life in rural areas and small towns without providing any particular context that might help them think productively, here's how they respond.
In my view, the rural areas, people may have a sense of community, going back to the basic way of life, living off the land or being close to their neighbors.
Stronger family values, maybe a better sense of community.
Peaceful to a degree, but then again, not as many choices or options either.
Lack of choice in terms of restaurants and entertainment, potentially less hectic environment, less traffic, more open spaces, more green spaces.
Lack of diversity, lack of exposure to other cultures.
And within that ethic, you don't really ask for help.
I don't want to say a museum-like kind of activity, but
maybe a museum of things that used to be relics. You know, this is the way America was 50, 100 years ago, but today it isn't.
These kinds of responses don't indicate a mindset compatible with productive intervention. The next set of clips shows people responding to the simplifying model. The researcher read a paragraph aloud based on the patchwork effect idea, and then asked questions like, based on what I've just read, could you describe what the patchwork effect is? Why is it important? What can we do about it? The video excerpts you'll see next were drawn from various places in the subsequent conversations.
The lack of support services for people living in the country, because the infrastructure for healthcare services and transportation was inadequately developed.
People are abandoning the area that has been patchworked or piecemeal together because the infrastructure has not been established.
Sometimes because of that effect that it's making certain places, for example, like smaller other cities, unlivable just because they can't develop those, which would otherwise be a good place for, economic growth and development.
We're not investing enough in rural communities, so we don't have the infrastructure in rural communities to help them thrive, so people are leaving rural communities.
The underdevelopment of the infrastructure in rural areas that forces people to go to other areas of bigger cities so that they can survive.
There's lack of development where people who are from that area are now asked, well, not asked, but because of the lack of support from government and city and state officials are being forced to migrate to other areas due to the lack of development within those areas or lack of funds being channeled into those areas.
The community suffers, society suffers, health and welfare suffer. We don't have an infrastructure in place to handle the healthcare situations, the social problems that could exist. You've got schools, education, everything, nothing is fully established. We've got pieces of things in place, but not anything to address the entire picture and all the needs of a family or of individuals.
There are more.
So I think that often we assume that people cannot reason about these issues in ways that are relatively profound. But they're really pretty good instant learners, and they have available to them lots of other things that are not being summoned, they're not being recruited